I want to talk to you today about something that is not on the radar, literally. Right now, in this moment, as we sit here on Sunday, April the 26th, 2026, the entire country is focused on the storms, the tornado watches, the squall lines, the Enid damage, Monday's severe weather threat for the Mid-South, and that focus is completely justified. Those threats are real, they are dangerous, and I have spent the last 2 weeks of videos making sure people are prepared for them. But today, I'm pulling back. Way back. Because while everyone is watching the next tornado warning drop on their radar app, something far bigger and far less understood is quietly building in the background. A shift that is going to change the character of this country's weather from the ground up. A shift that is going to affect the water you drink, the food you eat, the energy bills you pay, and the physical safety of hundreds of millions of Americans over the next 3 to 6 months. And I'm genuinely alarmed by how few people are connecting the dots on what is actually coming. Nobody is ready for this. Let me explain why. Here's the thing about major weather shifts. They rarely happen because of one thing. They happen because multiple independent atmospheric and oceanic systems all arrive at the same inflection point at the same time. And right now, I count 5 distinct, independently confirmed, scientifically documented forces that are all converging simultaneously, pointing in the same direction, amplifying each other, building toward a summer that could be genuinely historic. Let me name all 5 of them right now, and then I'm going to explain each one in detail. Force 1. El Nino is no longer a possibility. It is essentially locked in, confirmed at 85% probability by the world's leading climate centers, with an 80% chance of reaching strong status and a 25% chance of reaching super El Nino territory by late 2026. The WMO just issued a statement this week saying climate models are strongly aligned, and there is high confidence in the onset and further intensification of El Nino. Force 2, the U.S. drought just got dramatically worse. As of April 14th, 61% of the lower 48 states are in at least moderate drought, up from 56% just 3 weeks earlier. That is 45 states. That is 149 million people. The drought did not get better during April's active severe weather pattern. It got worse. Force 3. A June heat dome is already being forecast by major climate modeling firms, specifically targeting the Pacific Northwest and Western U.S., described as potentially semi-permanent, capable of generating record warmth, and threatening to accelerate what is already a catastrophically low western snowpack. Force 4. The Colorado River Basin's snowpack has collapsed to all-time record lows, potentially worse than any year in the SNOWTEL data record going back to the early 1980s, following the historic March heat wave that one climate analyst described as an unprecedented collapse of mountain snowpack during what should have been the very peak of seasonal accumulation. Force 5. The Southeast, Georgia, North Carolina, South Carolina, is in its driest stretch since records began in 1895. Not since last decade, not since the previous century. Since 1895. 131 years. 5 forces, all confirmed, all moving in the same direction, all converging on the summer of 2026. And most people have no idea about any of them because they've been watching tornado watches for the last month. Let's go through each one. The World Meteorological Organization released its latest global seasonal climate update just this week, and the language is unambiguous. Sea surface temperatures in the equatorial Pacific are rising rapidly, pointing to a likely return of El Nino conditions as early as May through July 2026. Climate models are now strongly aligned, and there is high confidence in the onset of El Nino, followed by further intensification in the months that follow, according to Wilfran Mufuma Okia, Chief of Climate Prediction at WMO. High confidence from the World Meteorological Organization in El Nino onset by this summer. When the forecasts were first published in early April, NOAA put El Nino emergence at 62% probability. 3 weeks later, the picture has sharpened dramatically. La Nina collapsed, the equatorial Pacific crossed into ENSO neutral territory, and the April model consensus now shows El Nino conditions at 85 to 94% probability through the summer and beyond. The CPC has issued an official El Nino watch. ECMWF and NOAA now estimate an 80% chance of a strong El Nino by October through December 2026, and a 25% chance it reaches super status, a sea surface temperature anomaly above 0 degrees Celsius. Let me explain why that 25% super El Nino probability matters so much, because I don't think most people understand what a super El Nino actually does to the world's weather. The 3 super El Nino events of modern history, 1982-83, 1997-98, and 2015-16, were not simply large El Nino events. They fundamentally reorganized global atmospheric circulation for 12 to 18 months. They disrupted monsoons. They produced catastrophic droughts on one side of the planet while creating record flooding on the other. They caused global average temperature to surge by fractions of a degree in a single year, which sounds small until you realize that a global average represents billions of square miles of atmosphere. Ocean and land surface all average together. The 1997-98 Super El Nino contributed to a year that was, at the time, the hottest in recorded human history. The Climate Impact Company's constructed analog for 2026 describes the ENSO outlook as a fortified strong El Nino ahead, with outlooks confident due to the immense upper ocean heat in the equatorial Pacific Ocean. Australia's Bureau of Meteorology relative Nino 3. 4 index forecasts indicate potential for the 2026 El Nino to surpass peak intensity of the 1983, 1997, and 2015 El Nino events late this year, surpass 1997 and 2015. Those are 2 of the 3 most powerful El Nino events ever recorded. And a credible established climate forecasting firm is putting that possibility on the table for late 2026. Now, I want to be responsible here. The so-called spring predictability barrier, the period from roughly March through May when El Nino forecasts carry their highest uncertainty, means that we should not treat any of these probabilities as certainties. The WMO itself acknowledges this. The spring predictability barrier is a challenge for the certainty of forecasts at this time of year. Forecast confidence generally improves after April. By May, we will have a much clearer picture of how strong this El Nino is going to get. But here's the bottom line. El Nino is coming. Strong El Nino is the most likely outcome. And the implications of that for the United States, the hurricane season, the summer heat, the drought trajectory, the wildfire risk, are enormous. And most people are not thinking about any of it because they've been watching tornado season. Let me show you something that I think is one of the most underreported stories in American weather right now. As of April 14th, 61% of the lower 48 states are in at least moderate drought. That is 45 states and nearly 149 million people. The drought coverage grew by 5 percentage points in just 3 weeks, from 56% in late March to 61% in mid-April. 5 percentage points in 3 weeks. While the country was getting drenched with severe thunderstorms and tornado outbreaks, the drought was getting worse, not better, even as the storm track was cranking out multiple active weather systems per week. How is that possible? Because drought is not just about whether it rained last week. It's about long-term moisture deficits accumulated over months and years. The rains that came with the April severe weather events were not broad, soaking, drought-busting rains. They were intense, localized, often violent rainfall events that produced flash flooding in specific areas while leaving the broader region, and especially the subsurface soil moisture profile, largely unchanged. When 3 inches of rain falls in 1 hour during a supercell, most of it runs off. It fills streams and causes flooding. It does not sink into the soil profile and replenish the aquifers and the root zone moisture that crops and grasslands depend on. NOAA's NWS Central Region Climate Outlook, issued April 20th, confirms that about 60% of the CONUS is experiencing drought conditions, with above normal temperatures in recent weeks increasing evaporative demand. El Nino watch is now in effect. Evaporative demand. That is the technical term for how much moisture the atmosphere is pulling out of the land surface and plants. When temperatures run above normal and relative humidity is low, which has been the case across large portions of the plains and south this spring, the atmosphere acts like a sponge, pulling moisture out of the soil, out of vegetation, out of reservoirs. Even when some precipitation falls, the increased evaporative demand can consume that moisture faster than it accumulates. The drought grows. The southeast is the new drought hotspot. Georgia, North Carolina, and South Carolina are in their driest stretch since September 2025, breaking records that go back to 1895. Since 1895. Let that sink in for a moment. The southeast, a region that many people associate with humidity, afternoon thunderstorms, and reliable summer rain, is experiencing its driest stretch in 131 years. And this is happening at exactly the same time that El Nino is building in the Pacific. Temperatures are projected to run above normal from May through July across the south, and a June heat dome is being forecast for the western U.S. that could extend its influence eastward. NOAA's John Gottschalk, chief of the Operational Prediction Branch at the Climate Prediction Center, said drought conditions worsened or developed for much of the Great Plains, lower Mississippi Valley, and southeast U.S. due to warmer and drier than normal conditions this winter. Forecasters say those conditions are expected to worsen or spread in the coming months, particularly across the Pacific Northwest, Great Basin, Central Rockies, Southwest, and South Central Plains. Worsen or spread? That is the official NOAA language. Not improve, not recover, worsen or spread. Now I need to talk about what is being forecast for June, because this is the part of the story that I think is genuinely not on most people's radar yet. Climate Impact Company's constructed analog forecast for June 2026 projects a high amplitude, high pressure ridge over the northwest U.S. during June. The pattern is likely to become semi-permanent during the last half of the month. The upper ridge combined with strengthening drought supports possible record warmth, especially in the northwest U.S., gradually extending into southwest Canada to melt lingering historic mountain snows. Extreme heat risk also implicates California and the southwest U.S. prior to the onset of the wet monsoon. Dryness extends from the northwest to the upper Midwest and central Great Plains. A semi-permanent high-amplitude ridge over the northwest in June, on top of snowpack that is already at or near all-time record lows, on top of drought that already covers 61% of the country, on top of a developing strong El Nino that is amplifying the background warmth of an already historically warm year. This is how the worst heat waves in American history happen. Not randomly, not unpredictably. They happen when a persistent upper-level ridge parks over a region with depleted soil moisture, no snowpack buffer, and a warming trend that has raised the baseline temperature. Every one of those conditions is present in the American West right now. Yale Climate Connections described the March 2026 heat wave as one of the 6 most astonishing weather events of the century. Climate researcher Deirdre Desjardins wrote that the March 2026 heat dome was not a bolt from the blue. It was the most extreme pulse in a winter-long pattern that locked the western United States into warmth and the east into cold for months. Not a bolt from the blue, a pattern. And that pattern, the persistent tendency of the jet stream to buckle westward over the Pacific, amplifying ridges over the western U.S., has not gone away. It did not end when the March heat wave finally broke. It has been reasserting itself repeatedly throughout April, and it is going to reassert itself again in June. Global warming may have significantly contributed to the intensity of these record-strength heat domes in 2021 and now 2026 by pumping more heat energy into the system. A warmer atmosphere holds more moisture, meaning more water vapor is available for latent heat release in the cyclones driving ridge amplification. This is the mechanism that climatologists have been warning about for years. As the atmosphere warms, it holds more moisture. More moisture means more energy available in tropical and subtropical cyclones. More energy in those cyclones means more intense upstream diabatic heating over the oceans. And more intense upstream heating means stronger, more persistent ridges over downstream land areas. The heat dome in March 2026 was not just a weather event. It was a demonstration of this mechanism in action at a scale that scientists called astonishing and virtually impossible without climate change. And based on the forecasts now in front of us, it is going to demonstrate itself again in June. Over the northwest, over the southwest, over a landscape that is already baked, parched, and primed. I need to spend specific time on the Colorado River Basin because I think it is the single most underreported environmental story in America right now, and what happened to it this past March has implications that will be felt for years. The record-shattering March heat wave reached even the highest elevations of the Rocky Mountains, bringing about what can only be described as an unprecedented collapse of Colorado Basin snowpack during what would usually be the very peak of seasonal accumulation. While Colorado Basin's snowwater equivalent had already been tracking near or below modern record lows for most of the season, the March heat event produced a precipitous decline that brought current values essentially tied with 2015 for all-time record low for the date, with SNOWTEL records going back to the early 1980s. All-time record low Colorado Basin snowpack, tied with 2015, the year that was itself the beginning of one of the worst western drought periods in modern memory. And that record low is happening in a basin that was already under severe stress from a multi-decadal drought that has been depleting Lake Mead and Lake Powell for years. In the Colorado River Basin, a severe and pre-existing multi-decadal drought has already forced a contentious water allocation debate as demand greatly outpaces supply. Now, the record warm water year, 2025-2026, is threatening to throw this crisis into even higher gear. The 7 states that depend on Colorado River water, Arizona, California, Colorado, Nevada, New Mexico, Utah, and Wyoming, have been in negotiation for years about how to divide a river that no longer has enough water to fulfill all existing legal allocations. That negotiation just got dramatically more difficult because the snowpack that was supposed to provide this year's water simply is not there. The snowmelt pulse that normally recharges the river from April through July has been largely exhausted already by the premature melt that the March heat wave triggered. The river that millions of people and billions of dollars of agriculture depend on is going to be significantly lower this summer than forecasters had hoped even 2 months ago. AccuWeather warned in March that while early season heat can initially boost runoff and raise stream and river levels, rapid snowmelt may cause that runoff to peak earlier than usual. Once the mountain snowpack is depleted, stream, lake, and river levels could drop more quickly later this spring and summer. The surging heat and dry conditions in the Colorado Basin may accelerate declines in reservoir and river levels later this spring and summer. Earlier peak, faster decline. The runoff that should have gradually sustained river flows from April through September has already largely come and gone, triggered weeks ahead of schedule by March's record heat. The reservoirs got a brief pulse of water in late March and early April, but that pulse is fading, and with a semi-permanent heat dome forecast for the northwest and southwest in June, evaporative losses from reservoirs will accelerate just as inflows are declining. This is a water crisis that is unfolding in slow motion, and it is going to become much harder to ignore by midsummer. Okay, I've been delivering a lot of difficult information in this video, and I want to give you something genuinely positive, because there is real good news buried inside this El Nino story, and it directly affects the communities along the Gulf Coast and Atlantic seaboard that have suffered devastating hurricane seasons in recent years. El Nino suppresses Atlantic hurricane activity by increasing wind shear over the Atlantic. Colorado State University's April 9th forecast already reflects this, projecting just 13 named storms versus the 14-storm average, 6 hurricanes versus the 7-storm average, and 2 major hurricanes versus the 3-storm average. U.S. landfall probability is just 32%, compared to a historical average of 43%, a 32% U.S. landfall probability for hurricanes. After back-to-back devastating Atlantic hurricane seasons in 2024 and 2025, that is genuinely encouraging news for Florida, the Gulf Coast, the Carolinas, and the entire Atlantic seaboard. El Nino creates wind shear in the upper atmosphere over the tropical Atlantic, basically a ripping crosswind at altitude that tears apart developing tropical systems before they can organize into major hurricanes. The stronger the El Nino, the more shear, the more disrupted the hurricane season. And with an 80% chance of a strong El Nino by October through December, the most likely scenario for the 2026 Atlantic hurricane season is significantly below average activity. That does not mean 0 hurricanes. It does not mean 0 landfalls. Even in strongly suppressed El Nino seasons, dangerous storms can and do develop. But on a probability basis, the communities that were hammered in 2024 and 2025 are looking at a substantially safer hurricane season this year. And that is worth saying out loud. Let me put the whole picture together now, because I think it tells a story that almost nobody in this country is currently thinking about. We have just lived through the most active April storm season in recent memory, an EF4 in Oklahoma, an EF5 in Indiana back in March, record hail, squall lines in the middle of the night, 501 tornadoes through April 23rd, 100 above the long-term average pace, week after week of violent, exhausting, relentless, severe weather. And the instinct, the very human, very understandable instinct, is going to be, okay, spring is almost over, the worst is almost behind us. Let me exhale. But here's what the data is actually telling us about what comes next. The case for a hot summer 2026 doesn't rest on any single factor. It's the convergence of 3 independent amplifiers. El Nino now at 85% probability with an 80% chance of reaching strong, drought worsening to 61% of the lower 48 across 45 states, and a 55-year warming trend where 97% of major U.S. cities now run hotter summers than their 1970 baselines. Each amplifies the others. El Nino amplifies the drought. Drought amplifies the heat. The warming trend raises the floor that all of this sits on. And a June heat dome, already being forecast as potentially semi-permanent, arrives into that preconditioned landscape and transforms what would have been a warm summer into something potentially historic. Dry soil going into summer is one of the strongest predictors of extreme heat events, because there is no soil moisture to provide evaporative cooling. When soil is dry, incoming solar energy heats the ground and air directly instead of being used to evaporate moisture. It is the difference between putting a wet towel and a dry towel on a hot dashboard. The dry one gets scorching fast. 61% drought coverage. Historically low western snowpack. A Pacific Ocean that is building toward its potentially strongest El Nino in decades. A June heat dome already in the forecast. And a warming baseline that has already pushed 97% of major American cities to run hotter summers than they did half a century ago. Nobody is ready for this. And I mean that in the most specific, practical sense. People are not thinking about this. They are thinking about Monday's tornado threat, which they should be. That is the immediate life safety priority. But after Monday, after this week's severe weather winds down, there is going to be a moment where the sky gets quiet and people exhale. And that exhale needs to come with a clear-eyed understanding of what the next 3 months are setting up to look like. For May, the Climate Impact Company constructed analog shows a wet and cool start, with the constructed analog suggesting a wet surprise for Texas, potentially significant drought relief for the South and Southwest Great Plains. That is actually genuine good news for the Plains drought. May bring some drought relief to Texas and Oklahoma. That is real, and it matters for the agricultural communities that have been suffering through drought all spring. But the June and July picture, the semi-permanent Northwest Ridge, the continued drying across the upper Midwest and Central Plains, the extreme heat implicating California and the Southwest, suggests that any May relief is going to be partial and temporary at best in many areas. The summer shift is coming. It is already in the forecast data, and the communities that are going to feel it most, the Pacific Northwest, the Southwest, the Southern Plains, the Southeast, are the same communities that either just lived through record March heat or are living through record drought right now. I want to get practical, because big picture climate and seasonal forecasts are only useful if they translate into real decisions that real people can make right now. For everyone in the western U.S., especially the Pacific Northwest, California, Nevada, Arizona, Utah, Colorado, and Wyoming, the June heat dome forecast is real. The snowpack deficit is real. The water supply implications are real. If you have never had to think about water conservation seriously before, now is the time to start. Know where your water supply comes from. Understand whether your reservoir, your aquifer, your river is already under stress. If you live in fire country, and with 61% drought coverage and record low snowpack, fire country is expanding, take your defensible space preparation seriously before June. Do not wait for a fire watch to think about it. For farmers and agricultural producers across the central and southern plains, May bring a wetter than expected pattern. And if you are managing drought-stressed land, pay close attention to that window. The Climate Impact Company is flagging a wet surprise for Texas in May. That moisture, if it arrives, is precious. Maximize any opportunity to capture it in soil and reservoir storage. The summer outlook beyond May is not encouraging for many of these areas. For families across the South and Southeast, your drought is the driest stretch in 131 years in some states. With above normal temperatures forecast for May through July and a developing El Nino shifting rainfall patterns, the summer heat and drought combination could be severe. Think now about how you will manage extreme heat events, air conditioning maintenance, cooling centers, checking on elderly neighbors, understanding the signs of heat illness. Heat kills more Americans every year than any other weather phenomenon. And this summer's setup is pointing toward one of the more dangerous heat risk environments in recent years. For everyone along the Atlantic and Gulf coasts, the hurricane season outlook is genuinely more favorable than the last 2 years. A 32% U.S. landfall probability versus the average of 43% is meaningful and real. But do not take that as a guarantee of safety. Stay prepared. Have your hurricane kit. Know your evacuation routes. One landfalling major hurricane can make a below-average season feel catastrophic if it hits a populated area. Here is where we stand on Sunday, April 26, 2026. The immediate priority remains this week's severe weather, Monday's outbreak across the Mid-South, Tuesday's continued threat as the front stalls, the late-week cold snap with potential hard freezes. Those are the present tense dangers that need your attention right now. But beyond this week, in the quiet that is going to settle over large parts of this country sometime in the next 10 days as the storm track finally reorganizes, a different kind of danger is building. One that does not announce itself on a radar. One that does not come with warning sirens and tornado watches. One that unfolds slowly over weeks and months until suddenly the reservoir is lower than anyone expected. The heat is breaking records that should not be breakable. And the wildfire that started somewhere in a dry canyon is racing toward a community that thought summer was just supposed to be warm. El Nino conditions are expected to emerge during boreal summer and autumn, with some suggesting El Nino SST thresholds as early as May through July 2026. Climate change can amplify associated impacts because a warmer ocean and atmosphere increases the availability of energy and moisture for extreme weather events such as heat waves and heavy rainfall. The weather shift that is coming is real. It is confirmed by NOAA, the WMO, the Climate Prediction Center, and multiple independent climate forecasting firms. It is not a fringe prediction. It is not alarmism. It is what the data says. Nobody is ready for it. But you can be. Stay tuned this week for severe weather updates, and after this week passes, stay educated, stay aware, stay connected to the bigger story that is unfolding behind the immediate headlines. I'll see you in the next one.